So let's get on to the 6 steps. You obviously we've talked about this. It's a core of the book, really, isn't it? You've got a chapter for each of the 6 steps. But you know, can you talk through the 6 steps for implementing machine learning in organizations, and walk us briefly through these steps and their significance, and I think if you're and I think we'll see how that resonates with HR and particularly people analytics leaders who are starting to bring some of these machine learning technologies into some of the work that they're doing as well.
Sure. So the first three of the 6 steps are basically pre-production, and they involve that same three things I've been mentioning. So what's predicted, how well, and what's done about it. They're not quite in that order. But and then the next three are the actual production where you're conducting the machine learning project. And those three sort of always exist by definition of machine learning. They've always been there since the 60s when people first started applying linear regression to target marketing and to do credit score risk assessment. And those three are prepare the data, train the model. That's the rocket science part, right? That's the analytics, that's the number crunching. So you're learning from that data. And what you're learning is a predictive model, the patterns or formulas, and then deploy it. That's step 6. So I culminate with step 6, the way I formulated. Certainly after that, there's still monitoring and maintaining and managing. Once you've actually launched a rocket, you got to keep the astronauts up there alive. You got to keep it working, right? In the case of machine learning, you've launched it. Now you've changed the way you're doing business, and you got to keep that new process going. But what I'm addressing first and foremost is that we often don't get to that culminating step. So so that we know that the model is actually going to be valuable for the intended use, so that stakeholders understand that and understand why, in terms of certain mechanics and arithmetic about the metrics of how well it performs, and so that they're willing to greenlight it and we can actually successfully put it into action. So I'll just to flesh that out in a little more detail, the first 3 steps are to establish the deployment goal, that's step 1, the prediction goal, that's step 2, and the metrics, that's step 3. So those first 2, the prediction goal and deployment goal, not in that order, is what you're predicting, what you're doing about it. That defines the use case, but you have to get really detailed, and that's why there's a separate step about that prediction goal. Which employees who've been on the job for at least 2 years are going to leave their job in the next 3 months, et cetera, et cetera. You need to be very, very specific about all the caveats and qualifications that define what's typically a yes-no binary prediction goal that the model's going to put probabilities on. Every single aspect of that, there could be a lot of qualifications to that, defining that goal, is relevant to the business. So business pragmatics, you need business stakeholders weighing in on that level of detail. The metrics also brings up some cans of worms, because everybody's always talking about accuracy. Accuracy is simply how often is the model correct, and it's completely the wrong metric for almost all projects. It's impertinent, and it's gravely misleading. Of high accuracy, hey, this thing's 95% accuracy, and it implies the thing has really high confidence for both positive and negative cases. That is to say that it implies some kind of almost crystal ball level of incredible predictive performance, and it generally can't get to that level of performance. So what metrics do apply? Well, then it turns out there's a difference between technical metrics, which is sort of like how much better does this thing predict than guessing. That's called lift, and that can be really interesting, but it's only telling you the relative performance compared to a baseline like random guessing. What you also need are the business metrics, the ROI, the profit, the number of dollars saved, the number of employees saved, the savings on cost of hiring new employees relative to the expense incurred to retain existing ones, which tends to be lower. So it's a good payoff, but you have to measure those. So translating what the model would deliver in those business terms, which are very concrete and any stakeholder can understand them, actually takes a little bit of tricky legwork. They depend entirely on exactly the plan of how you're going to use the model, how operations are going to change. You can't just say, hey, this model's worth $1 million. It's only relative to exactly how you intend to use the model. This is something the industry hasn't quite wrapped their head around. Data scientists are not trained to translate from technical to business metrics. this leaves stakeholders in the dark, and that's a big piece of why they're ultimately going to get cold feet and be unwilling to change whatever this very critical large-scale operation for the company is. Sometimes it becomes a lot easier to kill the project and sweep the failure under the rug. So that's sort of the phenomenology we're seeing a lot of right now.
So those first three steps are essentially let's define the problem properly that we're trying to solve, essentially, and obviously that involves not just a bunch of data scientists go off and do it. That involves working with business stakeholders to properly define the problem. The second one is, how do we intend to tackle the problem, and what are we trying to do? The third one is, how are we going to measure success? So what are the business metrics and what we're going to do this? And that will help us understand whether it's even worthwhile doing, isn't it? We've got the problem, we know what we're trying to do, we know how we're going to measure success, and then that leads to the second three the second three steps that you talked about in terms of preparing the data, building the model, and deploying it. And as you said afterwards, obviously you want to check the efficacy of the model, because you're possibly going to have to update the model moving forward, and also measure the success and go back to say, okay, well, we've deployed it now. Is it actually meeting the metrics that we defined in the third step?
Exactly. Step 3, which is the metrics and establishing how you define performance and what your goals are, quantitative goals are. This is usually an offline process, and at the same time, you're doing an evaluation and an assessment of how good the model is, how well it predicts, and what kind of value it could deliver depending on the deployment. And then after you deploy, yes, indeed, you're continuing to monitor moving forward, and the same metrics tend to apply. So that's the basic gist. Now that step 5, that's the core rocket science. That's where you're learning from data. That's the exciting technology that we're all trying to leverage. And as with most data scientists, in my origin, that's all I used to care about from the beginning. I was like, wow, learning from data, it's like a nerd's dream, right? Learning from data to ascertain patterns or discoveries that are true, that tend to hold over new unseen cases never before witnessed, not included in the training data. That's really cool science. And yes, lo and behold, it is potentially valuable to be able to predict. Not just cool, but actually valuable if you can get it to deployed. But because that technology is so cool and the data scientists get so excited about it, that's all that again, this applied to me in early years for sure. And I think it applies to most data scientists. They just want to load the data and make a model. But you can't just skip over those pre-production steps, because they define exactly what data you need by way of defining exactly what you need to predict, which is determined by exactly how you intend to use the prediction. So you're working backwards in both directions, right? You have to go through the pains of this organizational process if your use of this amazing rocket science is actually going to turn out to be valuable.
In this series, we will be speaking to a range of senior leaders who are pushing a data-driven and digital HR agenda. Make sure that you subscribe via your podcast app of choice, and also via our YouTube channel for free and regular interviews with the digital HR leaders of the future.